Captain Phillip, landing at Sydney Cove in 1788, brought with him Australia's first grapevines. The cuttings were planted on an adjacent hillside sloping gently down to newly named Farm Cove. Sea breezes did not suit the vines, so they were replanted in the grounds of Australia's first government house in Parramatta, some 12 miles from Sydney. From this vice-regal but nevertheless humble beginning, a great primary industry developed, its vineyards spreading to all mainland states of Australia. Originally nurtured by famous pioneers such as John MacArthur and Gregory Blaxland, Australia's wine industry is now valued at £100 million. Believed to be Australia's first underground wine cellar and built in 1838, this simple structure is still in use, as are some of the picturesque cottages erected by our early wine growers over a century ago. Many of the older wineries followed the architectural patterns of their European counterparts. This was understandable, as many of the early vignerons came from winemaking countries of the Old World. As the industry prospered, so did Australian wineries grow in size and numbers. As far back as 1873, wines made in Australian wineries were awarded numerous prizes against all comers at the Vienna exhibition. Many smaller wineries are operated as efficiently and with the same pride as the larger ones. Some delightful wines come from these quaint old establishments. Australian wineries produce a higher percentage of clear, sound wine than those of any other country in the world, due to the quality of the fruit, the healthy, predictable climate, and above all, the careful winemaking methods. As summer draws to a close, grape pickers come in droves to gather the lush, ripe harvest. Grapes must be picked for best winemaking results at just the right time, so every able-bodied member of the family is pressed into service over the few critical weeks. Most Australian grapes are grown by independent vignerons who are concerned only with the care of their vineyards and the production of grapes, which they sell to the wineries. The climate and earlier control of diseases make the life of the Australian wine grower less hazardous than his European brother. Many types of vehicles are pressed into service to transport the precious fruit to the wineries for processing. Man has had the secret of winemaking for thousands of years. First known reference to wine being in the Old Testament in the book of Genesis, where in chapter 9 mention is made of Noah and wine husbandry. Every individual consignment of grapes is weighed as it arrives at the winery. Loads of up to 10 tons are quite common. Samples from each load are taken and tested for quality and sugar contents. Grapes are dumped into chutes or wells immediately after weighing. They are mechanically transported to the crusher, which separates the stalks and other extraneous matter from the flesh and skins, now known as must. After crushing, the must is pumped to fermenting tanks. A pure culture of yeast is added to the must. The yeast converts the grape sugar to alcohol and carbon dioxide gas. In fact, turns the grape juice into wine, either white or red. The color of wine depends to some extent on the color of the grapes, but more particularly on whether the skins are removed immediately after crushing or remain during fermentation. Dry wines are made up allowing the yeast to convert all the grape sugar to alcohol. Enologists or wine chemists are constantly on hand to take control samples of the product at various stages of fermentation. With fermentation complete, the wine is ready to be pumped to the storage tanks. The skins and pips are mechanically pressed to extract the last vestige of remaining juices. The remaining skins are treated in the distillery, traditionally known as the still house, little changed in 100 years, for the production of grape spirit. Modern boilers produce the steam to operate the stills. Some wines have grape spirit added to them. This stops fermentation and preserves the natural grape sugar in aperitif and dessert wines. The young wines are next pumped to large oak vats to mature. When ready, they're filtered by modern hygienic machinery where further residue is removed. Next, into smaller casks for further maturation. The casks are rolled to storage points in cool, dark cellars where nature is allowed to complete the aging process. Old techniques of winemaking are in many cases applied in modern fashion. In this case, white wines are allowed to complete their fermentation in great glass-lined steel tanks. Again, tests are being made. In this instance, from vast 15,000-gallon dome-topped holding tanks. The winery laboratory, nerve center of the whole fascinating process of winemaking, maintains constant vigilance to ensure quality and purity at all stages of production. Modern scientific equipment ensures that the final product will reach the desired standard of quality. But from the old winemaker's point of view, there is only one way to test for quality. Many millions of gallons of wine stored in various parts of Australia are mellowing and improving to delight the palates of wine lovers not only in Australia but overseas, where Australian wines are becoming ever more popular, where Australia has established a high reputation as a wine-producing country. This is not an oil refinery, but a battery of storage tanks at a modern winery where wines are held for distillation of wine spirit. Cheapest and most efficient method of dispatching wine over long distances is by stainless steel container. These tanks, each of 500 gallons capacity, are being loaded onto rail vans for transit to the seaboard, where they're hoisted directly into the ship's holds for overseas delivery. Australia is now exporting nearly 2 million gallons of wine annually. Most wine is still transported in the familiar oak cask. Wine bottling in hygienic, sterile rooms is a far cry from the extremely crude methods in use even a century ago. Some wine, particularly white table wine, is never stored for long periods. Some of the reds and fortified wines, however, are left to mature in bottles for varying periods. Old mine tunnels and deep excavations are often used for bottle storage. Champagne is traditionally made from a delicate neutral type wine. After adding yeast and other constituents, the wine is bottled and allowed to ferment. After about 6 months, the yeast sediment is dislodged by thorough agitation. The bottles are then placed on shaking tables where they remain for a week to allow the yeast to settle out. Then each day they're carefully shaken, turned slightly, and their leaning angle gradually increased until after several weeks they become upright. The bottles, with the sediment now on the cork, are examined and transferred to baskets for carrying to the cold box. Here, refrigerated brine freezes the yeast and a little champagne in the bottleneck. The frozen champagne is clearly seen. The cork is removed and the small ice block forces out the sediment. The bottle is topped up with previously treated champagne and recorked. After nearly 200 individual handlings, it's ready for labeling and marketing. Little is known about the involved research and care that goes into the making of wine. The Australian Wine Research Institute, with its miniature pilot winery, is fully equipped for vintaging and maturing wines under closely controlled conditions. The Research Institute, established in 1955, carries out research projects previously impossible in Australia. Its findings are aimed at making Australian wine even better each year. Roseworthy College has long been famous for training enologists, those skilled in the science of winemaking. Once, Australian students went abroad to further their wine studies. Today, they, together with many overseas students, go to Roseworthy. Some of Australia's greatest winemakers have qualified at this college. From the beginning, Australian Vinerans have grown and processed their wine with knowledge and affection. For over 150 years, the best overseas techniques have been brought to Australia, and many actually have been improved. Real wine knowledge can only come from studying and drinking it, from learning to appreciate it. For wine is a work of art, and Australian wine will always remain so whilst grapes are growing.